Thanks. Congratulations on surviving it this long. What I'd like to do is make some impact, some attempt to answer these questions, and then we'll stop at 9 o'clock, and then people can carry on discussing privately afterwards. Multiverses. If multiple universes exist with different rules of physics, why would there be a single collection of mathematical rules to describe them? I think that's a very good question. See, what the M theory, string theory people say is there is this one fundamental theory, let's call it M theory, which is true everywhere in all the universes, and it just works itself out differently in the different universes. Do you follow me? So they're still believing that there is in fact one fundamental set of physical laws. It just works out differently in the different universes because of the way things sort of freeze out. Make sense? And I think that's, I mean, if you were, and there are some Christians, I was just talking about someone called Don Page, who was a research student of Stephen Hawking's, worked with Stephen Hawking, is now a professor in Canada, and is a convinced Christian. And I understand believes in string theory and the multiverse. Now, if you take that point of view, you probably gather I've got doubts about that, you would still say, well, God is the sort of fundamental upholder of all that is. And he's, if you like, laying down the fundamental rules which make multiverses possible and make our universe possible. But certainly, I mean, what the people who believe in multiverses believe is that there are sort of fundamental laws of physics which are true everywhere, which work out differently in different universes. And from a philosophical point of view, you might still want to ask, well, what is it that guarantees those fundamental laws and make somehow these fundamental laws work out so that life is possible in one universe? It still leaves all sorts of questions unanswered. Let's put that one away for the moment. What are the 9 or 10 dimensions of space? First of all, I don't think anybody can imagine 9 or 10 dimensions of space, but mathematicians can do the maths. In other words, they can work out the properties of 9 dimensions of space without being able to imagine what it would look like. The number of dimensions really means how many numbers you need to give to define a point. In our world, you need to know how far that way, and how far up. And if you know east, west, and north, south, and altitude, you can define a point. Okay? You only need 3. And incidentally, one of the unexplained constants, if you like, in our universe is the fact that there are 3 dimensions. A 4-dimensional universe wouldn't work, and a 2-dimensional universe wouldn't work for all sorts of reasons. You know, it's technical, and I'm not going to go into it, but it's really important that we're in a 3-dimensional universe because all sorts of things wouldn't work in any other number of dimensions. It's not too difficult to imagine sort of one more dimension. Imagine that you see a string, a thin wire going across a gorge. That, in principle, is a one-dimensional object. To define where you are, you just need to know the length. Just one point along the string. It's just got a length, and that's all it's got. When you get up really close, of course, it's got a thickness. And if you're a little tiny bug, you can go round the string as well as along it. So if you're small enough, you can see it's got 2 dimensions, not just 3, not just 1. You see what I mean? It's an object which, from the large enough scale, looks like a single one-dimensional thing. But when you get really close up to it, or if you're small enough, it's apparently got more, 2 dimensions. You can go round it as well as along it. So that's maybe a picture that would help you understand that there could be small dimensions all wrapped up that we can't see, but if you were small enough, like very, very, very much smaller than an atom, you could go round as well as along. I don't know if that helps or not, but I mean, it is certainly, these are physical dimensions that they're talking about, and they can do the mathematics of the dimensions, but nobody can imagine them. That's a very important question I'll come back to, and that one. This is another sort of technical thing about the dimensions of the universe. Would it be impossible to judge if the acceleration approaches the speed of light? It is true that all sorts of things get very difficult when speeds approach the speed of light. And one of the reasons why it's difficult to talk about multiverses is that although no speed that's measured is ever bigger than the speed of light, in fact the dimensions of the bubble can get away faster than the speed of light. In other words, that sounds a contradiction in terms, but the bubble actually expands faster than the speed of light, even though at any point in the universe nothing goes faster than the speed of light. That sounds rubbish. I think what I would say to the person who put this question is it's quite difficult to answer these questions technically, but I think the people who do the theory properly do have a proper description of it. You also referred to the whole question of spirit, and I think this is quite interesting. I mean, as a Christian, I believe in real things that are not physical. In other words, prayer, I think, is something real, a real communication with God. But I don't think that you can, I don't think you can sort of measure prayer waves. You see what I mean? I don't understand it, but I do think there is a real sort of a spiritual reality which is closely linked to the physical world, and yet it is not something that has mass or weight or time. God is a spirit. So, I don't know if that helps or not, but...
Could that be one of the other dimensions?
I think not. I once reviewed a book by somebody who got very excited about the fact that there were 9 dimensions and reckoned that the other 6 dimensions were actually heaven and hell and whatnot, and that's where we would go. We'd leak out into the other dimensions, and that's where Jesus is, and that's where heaven is, and so on. I think that's a complete misunderstanding. The string theory is a physical theory of physical dimensions, and I don't think it's very helpful to imagine that somehow you can sort of explain spiritual realities in terms of clever physics. But good question. Given that scientists are broadly dealing with the same science, why do some believe in God and some don't? This is a very, very interesting question. I mentioned Don Page, who was a student of Stephen Hawking, who is a convinced Christian. Stephen Hawking is a fairly convinced atheist, dealing with the same phenomena. And there doesn't seem... Well, here's an interesting fact, that the number of people in a science faculty of a university who are convinced Christians is a higher percentage than in a non-science faculty. And if you knew that. In other words, there are fewer Christians studying philosophy and linguistics and all that sort of stuff than there are studying physics. And I tend to think, not that scientists are clever and get the right answers, I think they're having to deal with reality. And if you're a scientist, you're brought up against what an odd world we live in, and you're therefore able to somehow recognise, well, maybe there is a spiritual reality that I didn't know about. Can I tell you the story of someone who I met just before he left Aberdeen? He's now a professor down in York in a biological subject. And he used to teach in Aberdeen University lectures on evolution. And he would use his lectures on evolution to rubbish Christian faith. Which was, I think, a bit naughty. I don't think Christians should propagate Christian faith in their university lectures, and I don't think atheists should, Anyway, but he did. And at the end of one of his lectures, a rather brash American student, apologies to the Americans present, came up to him and said, "You don't believe all that crap, do you? You ought to read C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity," and walked off. And this chap was a bit put off. But that weekend, he was babysitting for his sister-in-law. Noticed on the wall, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Took it down and read it, and in a very short time was a Christian. About 2 years later, Billy Graham came to Aberdeen and had some of you may remember, at Pittodrie. And this chap at that stage was a fairly active Christian and signed up to be a counsellor. And in the meeting for counsellors, bumped into the brash American student who was also so it's quite interesting, you know, what convinces people. So, I mean, I'm not sure I haven't answered the question. It is a fact that, you know, scientists are dealing with the same issues. It's probably easier to be a physicist and a Christian than a biologist and a Christian. There's sort of issues in biology are rather more sort of difficult, but there are lots of Christian biologists. So, yeah. Do come back to me with questions in the middle while I'm struggling here. Here is such an interesting question, I don't know how I'm going to try and answer it. Is there any one thing that science could discover which would prove that God does not exist? And I think that's a very, very interesting question. I think I've said that while it seems to me that the evidence of fine-tuning is consistent with Christian belief, it's the kind of thing that a Christian is comfortable with. This is the way I would expect the world to be. And therefore I'm not embarrassed by it in the way that an atheist is embarrassed by it. But I don't think it proves that God exists. And I don't think there's any proof in that sense that you sort of finish up and say, QED, God exists. And I suspect that therefore the opposite is also true, that there are not sort of specific things that, I mean, there are sort of things in the world that make it very hard to believe in God, particularly in the Christian God. It is very hard to believe in a God who is all-powerful and absolutely loving with all the evil and suffering in the world. And that's the real difficulty which Christians must wrestle with. And I think that's what would probably convince most people who were convinced there's no God. Well, there can't be a God if the world is like that. Now, that's a huge, huge problem, which I don't know the answer to. I say I know bits of answers to it. But that would be, to me, the biggest sort of argument against the existence of God, not any particular scientific discovery. There's a question here about Jesus being the Son of God. Now, if there was a very clear archaeological scientific proof that the bones of Jesus were found in a tomb in Palestine, that to me would mean Christianity is wrong. Okay, I think in that sense Christianity is open to disproof. I'm not sure that particular discovery saying, oh, that quasar's got a big redshift, and I don't think that sort of a discovery would affect one's belief in God. But it's a very, very interesting question.